Now, it's not surprising to learn that the cruise industry is continuing to grow, but the way that growth is changing cruising may affect us all. Hi, I'm Jan.
And I'm Tracey, and recently CLIA, the Cruise Line International Association, released its annual report for 2026. So CLIA is the association of most of the world's cruise lines. So this report provides a clear picture of where they think the cruise industry is heading.
So we went through the report, which is wrote from data from their industry partners, as well as polling from both travel agents and travelers, and we did our own research in order to explain what we believe is the 5 takeaways from this report. And those are: 1, we think that last-minute deals is pretty much the thing of the past. 2, why non-Caribbean cruising feels so much different. 3, why we think our loyalty matching is really becoming more of a thing. And then we're going to look at why some of your favorite destinations may become more difficult and certainly more expensive. And then maybe the most important is why you'll be hearing more 80s music on cruises. Now, we're going to start where the report does with announcing that in 2025, there were more people who went on cruises than any time in history. In fact, with having about a 7.5% increase over 2024. Also, in 2025, there was 3 times as many people who cruised than it was when Tracey and I did our first cruise back in 2005.
Now, despite this heavy growth, we are seeing that the growth rate for the good part has settled down from last year's projections. In fact, there were 500,000 fewer cruisers in 2025 than CLIA projected last year. Also, while CLIA forecasted that we would reach 42 million cruisers by 2028, this year they fortunately pushed that out to 2029.
Now, although we're seeing slower growth, we actually think that really just is signaling that we're finally leveling out after the hyper recovery growth we had after the pandemic and into more of a mature long-term growth cycle.
So cruising is going to continue to grow, especially when about 90% of those people who have cruised in the past report intending to cruise again. And almost 80% of those same cruisers are saying they're going to cruise within the next 2 years.
And new people continue coming to cruising. 3/4 of those who have never cruised reported to CLIA being open to taking their first cruise. And this percentage we've seen continues to increase over the last few years. So the bottom line is don't looking for any empty ships in the years to come.
So we also looked at the annual reports of the largest cruise corporations, and we found that both mass market and premium lines were sailing at over 100% capacity. If you've been sailing recently, that is completely obvious to you. All the indications are that from CLIA report is none of this is going to change in the near future.
Yeah, this confirms our assessment that the days of the last moment deals are largely gone. Instead, we've actually been seeing booking early as the best move for us. For example, when we booked our Oceania Amazon cruise about 2 years ago, what we found was by the time we got to embarkation day, the same cabin was costing thousands of dollars more.
And beyond how many people cruise, CLIA looked at where these cruisers are coming from. And here it is that the United States is the clear leader of all cruisers around the world. Americans account for 55% of all cruisers, and that number grew 7.5% from the year prior.
Yeah, now joining the United States as the top 5 cruising countries are mostly the English-dominated or dominant countries such as the UK, Canada, and Australia. Coming in second place was Germany, which actually had a 10% increase. Now, Germany actually kind of surprised us at first until we actually looked at our YouTube channel data. We find that Germany is actually in the top 5 viewers of our channel. So the bottom line here is I don't think Mein Schiff is going anywhere.
So China actually has had the largest increase in cruising with an increase of nearly 16%.
Yeah, but I wouldn't read too much into this. It's not like China is getting ready to take over the industry, although with a population of 1.4 billion people, they're worth keeping an eye on. Rather, that increase really is more of a rebound from not only the pandemic, but also a reduction that we had in China in cruising in 2019.
So it really is important to realize that between 2016 and 2018, China was actually the second largest country for cruising. However, well before the pandemic, cruising in China really began to decrease.
Yeah, because before 2019, cruise lines such as NCL were doubling down in China, even launching the NCL Joy specifically for the market. However, during this time between about 2016 to 2019, the cruise lines learned more about the Chinese consumer, and they learned 2 things. First of all, Chinese consumers much rather have shorter cruises, which is very good for cruise lines because they make more money off of short cruises. But they also found that Chinese passengers are among the very lowest when you're talking about your onboard spend. And that's very bad for cruise lines because 1/3 of all of cruise line revenues actually comes from onboard spending. So what we saw in about 2018 and then 2019, certainly when we saw a drop of cruising from Chinese passengers, dropped by 19%, was that cruise lines began to reduce their offerings. In fact, NCL actually pulled the Joy out of China. Remember, this is all before the pandemic. So even with their impressive 2025 growth, we have to remember that Chinese cruising on 2025 is still less than half of what it was in 2018.
But beyond the growth of each country, CLIA's report also tells us that globally, the average cruiser is almost 47 years old, and their cruise duration runs about 7 days. But this changes by region.
Yeah, for example, North American cruisers are basically the same as the global average. We average about 46 years old, and we take 7-day cruises. Now, among the youngest cruisers are those from Eastern Europe and South America, who are about 2 years younger than the global average and cruise a bit fewer days than we do.
Now, Western and Northern Europeans cruise longer. They go between 8 and 9 days per cruise, but they're also older, and their average age is about 49 years old. And then you look at people from Australia and the Pacific, they tend to cruise more than we do, but their average age is about 47 and a half. But as the cruisers from Asia, including China, who actually are the oldest cruisers, they are coming in at an average of 49 years old, but they also only cruise half as long as Europeans, their European counterparts, and they only cruise on average about 4 days.
Now, what I thought is interesting is you're looking at all these ages. They fit all of them really kind of fit right in the ages for Gen Xers like Tracey and I. In fact, what's interesting is when we go back to the 2025 CLIA report, we noticed that they said that Gen Xers was the generation that was most enthusiastic about taking a cruise. So again, maybe the upside is we're going to start hearing more 80s music on cruise ships, which we actually did in our last Oceania transatlantic cruise. But the next question is, where is everyone cruising?
Well, that's easy. It's in the Caribbean. Nearly 44% of all cruisers in the 2025 cruised to the Caribbean. And that was a slight increase over the year prior and over 3% higher than before it was in 2019, which was before the pandemic.
Yeah, and the second most cruised region is the Mediterranean, where 1 out of every 6 passengers cruise in 2026. In fact, if you look at Europe as a whole, a quarter of all the cruisers actually sailed somewhere in Europe in 2025.
The other region that was a mover in 2025 was Asia, which we saw nearly 20% increase in cruisers. And there's a few reasons that we believe that this is the case. First of all, take Japan. It ended up counting for 3/4 of the entire growth of cruising in Asia. For example, NCL alone more than doubled their cruises in Japan. In 2024, they had 10 cruises, but in 2025, they had 26 cruises.
Now, the second reason beyond China kind of rebounding from before the pandemic, what we found in 2024, which is really important, is China, for the first time, I think it was in May, began offering visa-free entry into Chinese ports. So it is now easier for foreigners to cruise in China than ever before.
Third, the issues in the Suez Canal in the Middle East have reshuffled the deck. Travel advisors have reported that political unrest and general security were the top external factors impacting cruising. And as a result of this, cruises to places like Africa and the Middle East, they actually dropped by 11% last year. And these ships ended up having to reposition, and many of these ships ended up moving to Asia.
Now, the other 2 destinations that were winners were the West Coast and Pacific and South America.
Now, a large reason for the West Coast and the Pacific sailing increases really had to do with another finding that we found in the CLIA report. People like to cruise near where they live. And about 60% of the global cruise industry is between the United States and Canada. So it does make sense to have more cruises off the West Coast.
Now, to demonstrate this, when you look at Caribbean cruises, Alaska cruises, and West Coast cruises, 90% of the people that are on those cruise ships actually are from America and Canada. And you've probably seen this yourself in your last Caribbean cruise.
So go to Europe, and about 80% of the people who cruise there, they're going to be Europeans. And if you want to test this theory, do like we did. Take an MSC cruise in the Med.
Yeah, a lot of Europeans there. Now, we see the same cruise local phenomenon in cruises to Australia and New Zealand, cruises to South America, and even to a lesser extent in Asia.
So the takeaway here is that if you're an American or a Canadian who normally sails in the Canadian, you need to be prepared for the fact that cruises in places like Europe and other part of the world, they're going to be much more, well, we'll say international. The culture is going to be different, and it might just be a different experience than you might be used to.
Now, as we explained in one of our videos we had last year, the CLIA report also illustrates that when you sail may be just as important as where. Consistently, the third quarter is the busiest, and the first quarter of the year, that's January through March, is the least busy, although that certainly isn't not busy.
So if you have kids, you'll know exactly why this is. Fall and spring, the kids are in school. And when the kids are out of school, that's when most families take their vacations.
And that's why when we sail when basically the kids are in school, so it's not too crazy on the ship.
So far, we talked about the growth of cruising, who's cruising, and where they're going to. But we haven't talked about is the ships here, because we see here in this CLIA report some foreshadowing of cruising to come.
And what we now know is there are more cruise ships at sea now than any time in history, with over 300 ocean-going vessels.
And more ships are coming. In 2026, CLIA cruise line members reported that they're going to add 8 new ocean-going ships, and this is going to increase the total passenger capacity by 3%.
And the growth is not ending. In 2037, it's estimated an additional 60 ships will be into the fleet, and that is going to add almost 30% more passenger capacity to the industry.
Of course, a decent number of older ships are likely going to be phased out. We've seen that ourselves. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, they've attempted to offload their smaller, older ships on Oceania, like the Oceania Insignia and the Regent Navigator.
Yeah, they've also announced that the NCL Sky and the Sun are due to be leaving the fleet in 2026 and 2027.
And Norwegian Cruise Lines is not the only cruise line with older ships. All of the major cruise lines have ships that are over 25 years old. But it's not just the older ships that we're talking about, but we're also talking about these ships that have the capacity within the 1,000 to 3,000 passenger capacities. And that's kind of the sweet spot for a lot of cruisers. These are what are the mid-sized ships, and what we're seeing is they're becoming fewer within the industry fleet.
Since 2018, for example, we've seen these mid-sized ships go from accounting for just almost 60% of the fleet all the way down to 37% today. And by 1937, how about 2037, CLIA actually sees these mid-class ships shrinking to just about 35%.
So today it's the smaller ships with under 1,000 passengers and the mega ships with over 3,000 passengers. And often some of those ships are over 5,000 passengers that account for over half of the industry's fleet.
Now, cutting the number of mid-sized ships in the fleet may limit the ability for us in the future to visit some of the locations outside of the Caribbean. A trend that we've been seeing is an increasing number of ports in amazing destinations have either already or planning to close their waters to large ships, or they're setting limits on the number of passengers who can visit. This leaves, in many cases, only the smaller and much more expensive ships being the only ones that can be able to go to these amazing ports.
But it isn't an accident that we're seeing these large-sized ships accounting for nearly 1/3 of the industry fleet. This is just economics. The economics of cruising means that a cruise line can make a far more profit on a large ship like a 5,000 passenger ship on a 7-day cruise than they can on 2 cruises on the same itinerary on a 2,500 passenger ship.
Yeah, and this strategy really works well when 40% of all cruises already are going to the Caribbean, where there is plenty of infrastructure for these new larger ships. It also explains why between 2025 and 2037, there are 6 new private resorts that have either just opened or being built by the cruise line specifically to give a place for these large ships to call upon, and probably most importantly for them, to increase more revenue.
But then there's the other side of the spectrum, and these are the ships with the capacities under 1,000 passengers, which today makes up 1/3 of the fleet. This is the type of ship that we personally like to sail when we have the opportunity. These are your small luxury and ultra luxury lines.
Yeah, now of the categories of cruising, it is the luxury cruising that may be the one with the biggest potential. CLIA reported that more travel agents were seeing growth in luxury bookings than any other segment of cruising, and well over double what they had a response for contemporary or mainstream lines. Last year also, CLIA noted there were now triple as many luxury ships on the seas as they were in 2010, and was projecting that luxury cruisers would be as many as 1.5 million in the future.
So this got us wondering whether this is connected to another trend we've seen, which is status matching. So companies like MSC and Explorer Journeys and Virgin Voyages, they all do status matching from other cruise lines as a way to break into the North American market. But in 2024, Royal Caribbean began a matching loyalty program among its internal brands, Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, and Silversea. And then in 2025, NCL followed suit, and they began matching between their three brands, the NCL, Oceania, and Regent Seven Seas.
Now, when the cruise corporations made these announcements, they also said that the reason for these changes was to encourage their passengers to explore different brands in the family. And since most cruisers start with the mass market ships, such as NCL or Royal Caribbean, this gives them an incentive to level up their experience to the smaller cruise lines. This all fits in with the overall trend that CLIA has noted that the industry is doubling down on smaller, more luxurious ships. And it may be because the market seems to be calling for as more Gen Xers are beginning to retire.
CLIA has many other interesting insights of the industry, to include a continued move away from traditional marine diesel oil to power their ships, that 7 in 10 cruisers take shore excursions, and that 60% of cruisers revisit ports they've already been to, and so much more.
All right, so we believe there's actually 5 lessons that from all this we're talking about that you should take away from this analysis.
The first one is book earlier. Again, we have personal experience with this one. We think that if you're waiting for those last minute deals, especially ones on better cabins or on premium lines, those days are increasingly behind us. What's happening is the demand is there, that the ships can charge what they want, and I don't feel like you're saving any money as you wait until the end.
Now, the second is, hey, try a cruise outside your comfort zone. If you've only cruised in the Caribbean, understand that, Europe, Asia, and South America may feel very different because you're having more people from those areas. The passengers, the food, the entertainment, the pace, and even that onboard culture can change dramatically depending upon where you sail. And honestly, we think that's one of the things we love about cruising overseas. It just makes cruising in the world so interesting, is those passengers you're getting ready to share the ship with.
Our third thing is think really carefully about the ship size. The type of ship you want may matter more in the future. What we're seeing again is the industry is moving towards either mega ships with all the bells and whistles or smaller luxury ships, while those traditional mid-sized ships, they're slowly disappearing. So if you like those classic mid-sized ships, now might be the time to start sailing them.
And the fourth is use those loyalty matching programs strategically. I know we've been doing that, and it really helps. The reason is because they're becoming more and more valuable than ever. Cruise corporations are increasingly encouraging travelers to move between brands within the family. This is not only to be able to help replace an aging population, but also trying to move people from those mass market lines into more expensive lines, such as your premium lines and your luxury lines. So if you already have status with Royal Caribbean or NCL or MSC or another line, it really opens a door to trying these more premium and luxury experiences. We've been using our platinum level on NCL to be able to match to platinum on Oceania, where we actually get a lot of different things, to include a lot more cruise credit to be able to spend on board.
Fifth, expect cruising to keep evolving. Cruising isn't slowing down. The industry is just changing, but it's growing and segmenting at the same time. And honestly, we think the next decade of cruising may look different than the one from the last.
Yeah. Now, finally, watch this video for ideas for your next adventure. And until the next horizon, keep on traveling.